Welcome to another exciting episode of Workplace Whispers with Dr. Ogunlowo. Now, this is the podcast where we share insights, strategies, and expert perspectives on human capital management and contemporary HR issues. Dr. Olufemi Ogunlowo is the founder and CEO of Strategic Outsourcing Limited, Nigeria's leading personnel outsourcing firm that has managed over 200,000 plus employees nationwide. With a first-class honors in civil engineering, a master's with distinction in water and waste engineering, and a PhD from Loughborough University, UK. Dr. Ogunlowo has also honed his expertise at top institutions like Cranfield University, Lagos Business School, and St. Charles Strategy School, Chicago. Now, beyond academia, he is a fellow of multiple professional bodies, a licensed HR practitioner, and the president of the Employers Association for Private Employment Agencies of Nigeria, member of Federal Employment Council, and council member of Nigeria Employers Consultative Association. Well, as you know, my name is Praise Umba.
And I'm Tosin.
Tosin, you didn't forget like last time.
No, we don't.
And of course, Dr. Ogunlowo.
Thank you,
always a
Tosi,
pleasure.
and Praise. Last time, as we were about to wrap up, Tosin dropped the question.
Yeah.
And I think we should start from there today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I'm going to ask you to ask that question again.
Okay, so from our last episode, we're discussing very elaborately on favoritism. And from your explanation, you say maybe a supervisor, a boss at work can can favor a particular employee. So I became, curious as to how when you score of your judgments, your parameters for favoring that particular employee, where should you begin to notice unconscious bias or uncommon bias as a supervisor, as an employer?
Just before we came into the studio, I was telling you that you've opened a can. That's a big can that you have opened, because the next 5-6 episodes we actually could be talking about biases. And the truth of the matter is that in everyday life, we all actually exhibit, one form of bias or the other. But there's a lot of science behind it also. And a lot of this has also been codified. So we're going to streamline our conversation to how it applies to the workplace. So first of all, what's a bias? I think, before we even start looking at the different kinds that exist out there, and basically, as we all know, even if we're not going to give the exact definition as put by any particular dictionary, basically means that a decision that is reached based on a factor, right? What is that X factor? And so there are different kinds of biases that are there. And there is cognitive bias, which uncommon bias is a cognitive bias. But you also have, as an example, anchor bias. There are people what's an anchor bias? The first thing you saw is the first thing you do. The first candidate that came into the interview and is the person you give the job to. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's, yeah, so there are different kinds of biases. You could have a bias based on, like we've talked about, sentiments. Like, for instance, is a Man U fan, all right? He's a Man U fan, and then he comes in, he has the lapel of Man U, and he's in the interview room, and you're also a Man U fan, and you're actually not asking questions about the interview again, but you're talking about the game yesterday. Unfortunately, your team won, so it was even a nice moment. Oh, did you see that goal? And therefore, the interview ends, and you're supposed to write the interview assessment. What else comes to mind? He was a great guy. We talked about Man U, but you can't put that in the assessment form. So basically, hire him, right? So it could be, and don't forget that there are also, as great as that sounds, you could also have negative effects, okay? Because there is empathy bias, for instance. He came into the interview, you asked, and he said the mother had died when she was 5, or all of that, and just because of that, even though they are not demonstrated sufficient competence or experience on the job, you felt empathy and you're going to consider them for that job. Now, the list is long, that is endless, that we can talk about. But many of the biases that are cognitive in nature are under the uncommon bias, broad terminology, But let's be honest. Almost every interviewer, because objectivity also it could be deemed a social construct to say, okay, what you term objective for you, somebody might say is subjective. So that's why you say that your facts should be the same, but your truth could differ, right? And so the place of bias in recruitment process is dicey, but it's real. And that's why you want to exercise caution, when you are recruiting or when you are making assessment on the suitability of a candidate. But without doubt, cognitive biases could play a major role in final decision-making process.
Now, the question for me now is, where do we draw the line with favoritism and biases? Where do we draw the line so that you don't, at the end of the day, imagine hiring based on he's a Man U fan and then, getting to the job, maybe he's not displaying the skills of a Man U fan in his role. That's what I'm trying to do. Where is that balance?
Okay, so again, I don't want us to just throw words around and create nomenclatures unnecessarily, because favoritism actually is an exhibition of your bias. Right. So basically, I know the question was trying to find a distinction, but what I'm trying to say is that it's like when you say one of the same, why did you favor him? And that's the question that we tried to establish in the earlier episode, which is the foundation is why. Because if you know the what, I want to hire him. Why do you want to hire him? Now, the why is really what helps you to know whether this is premised on expectation that is derived from logical reasoning. So this person has worked in similar roles, has demonstrated competence through his performance, and has been recommended by someone who has knowledge of him. Okay, and in his interview with me today, he has performed well. Okay, so I'll give him a rating of 5 out of 5. He got a favorable rating, right? So you have favored him. And so that's why we are saying you can't shy away from using certain words, because it doesn't connote negativity. If somebody walks into a room and says, oh, I got hired. So God favored you, right? Okay, but then somebody else will say, oh, let God favor us, but for God to favor us, he would make men to favor us. Okay, so it simply means that we cannot deny the fact that ultimately you will have to favor one over the other for one reason. So you make a choice. It's a choice. So it's the reason. And now that reason could be endless. Like I said, let's start with distinction bias, right? What's a distinction bias? Where you actually feel that the difference between those two things is not really, when you put them side by side, it's not significant, right? You can perceive the difference between two options more strongly when you put them side by side, but the candidate A and candidate B are not in the room at the same time with you. So that distinction bias, is very, we've talked about empathy bias, earlier on, where you can actually make those kind of decisions based on just feeling empathetic, towards the other person. If we want to continue on that list, and of course, effort justification. What's effort justification? Oh, she really tried. But she tried doing what? Well, he really tried. that bias was there. You value it more because you think that I had put in effort. It made an effort in the interview. And because of that, you feel that, okay, this is my candidate. What about the moral credential effect? And interestingly, sometimes some people actually use that as a negative bias, right? Somebody comes into an interview, all is wearing a band that says something about certain sect or religion or whatever. Some people would pick that and say, I'm not going to recruit this kind of person. Or some people will say that's the person I recruit. So it could go either way.
That actually got me my first job.
Oh, okay.
The wristband I was wearing.
Okay.
So apparently the HR was also part of that organization. We're like, okay, you know what?
Exactly.
So one of those things.
So
Yeah.
that's a bias that works in your favor. So as we said, it's truly about, at the end of the day, decisions are made by humans. Even when you put AI to make those decisions, the truth is it's going to be based on what it has learned. Right? So now, yes, without doubt, we say that artificial intelligence helps us to do better and makes decisions faster and all of that. But it's learning from human experiences. So without doubt, yeah, and we are learning that it is now learning from itself. But what is the foundation of that learning? So again, whether we like it or not, there will be bias in it. And they say he who writes the history writes it from his own prison. So that's element of bias, that you see there. So at the end of the day, as employers, we must ask ourselves, what bias am I entering into in this interview room with? Which one should I actually go in with? What should I drop at the interview table before I start engaging with the candidates?
So that ultimately says that it is reason. Once the reason is well defined, so the reason justifies the bias.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like you said earlier, drawing that line and knowing, the reason behind whatever it is that you're doing. But I also want to say, knowing that my HR, going back to what happened to me, and the HR that saw my wristband and said, okay, I'm going to hire you based off your wristband and your religious affiliation and all of that. So for HR in other organizations, what's that one watchword now in terms of hiring?
So,
if you were to do that,
yeah, which is, in one of the early episodes, we also talked about harvesting. We said you could harvest experience, you could harvest knowledge, you could harvest relationships, you could harvest assets. And I'll tell you what I mean by those, and then the list continues. What does it mean to harvest? You go into your farm and you bring your crops, so it's a produce. It's a reward for work. So how do you harvest your relationship? If you use your relationship to get something, you're harvesting that relationship. So for instance, you went to school with someone and is now the in-charge person in a particular organization, and then you pick up the phone and you call them to say, I need your help in getting this. I say, why not? Old school buddies. You have harvested that relationship. So you get a reward from it. And there's nothing wrong with harvesting a relationship. And that's why sometimes when people want to send their children to school, they start looking at, okay, if my child goes to this kind of school, he's going to grow up with this kind of people, and so on and so forth. So in many times, some of these things are not random. Even though here, sometimes we pretend that everything is random. In some places, people actually select which schools their children will go to because of that, intentionally. Exactly. So you can harvest that. So in harvesting that, is your relationship was probably, now we can define that relationship more broadly, because your affiliation is what you have harvested in this case. Now you could harvest knowledge, which is you are known to have expertise in a particular area, and so you are being sought or headhunted to come into another place to come and perform, that similar role at a higher level. So what you are basically doing is you are getting reward of your knowledge to become, hired into another role. You can also hire someone based on the experience that they have. Okay, so there are certain jobs where they say, okay, certain level of experience is required, and so you are looking for someone particularly who has that level of experience to come and to pretend or take care of a particular situation. And so if someone has that experience and is now hired into that new role, what he has been able to do is he has harvested his experience. So and it goes on and on and on and on. So the question is it favoritism? I need someone who has to have 15 years experience at the minimum. Why did I define 15 years? Because I have seen that with the responsibility I want to give to that role, the 15 years will provide some sort of solidity, for them to be able to anchor. Okay, so I've defined that. So I have 4 people to consider. 2 have 12 years, 1 has 11, and only 2 have 15 years. If I was using AI, for instance, AI will shortlist those 2 with 15 years only. Yeah, because it will say it matches and so on and so forth, my requirement. So basically, that means there is a bias based on, and indeed, it's even funny because the process of recruitment starts with a bias.
How so, sir? How so? How does
the entire process of recruitment starts with a bias? We are seeking to recruit goal-oriented, smart, energetic young people. What's that?
I would have thought it was a requirement.
That's a bias.
But in this context,
That
maybe
definition,
so.
defining what you
That's what. So that's
Okay.
So
you are
you see,
biased towards
towards
The
that.
other set of people, you've
Okay.
excluded some people
You have.
based on that requirement.
So if your recruitment process does not actually start with a bias, you're actually not seeking a refined, selection. Now the question now is, how do you then make your decision? Should you then make your decision based on the bias you have defined, or based on the fact that it's a Man U fan, or I'm not a Man U fan, so but based on the fact that he's a fan of a particular football club.
So I think what has happened now is that we've been able to put a proper definition, proper, we've been able to well-defined bias now. What bias means to somebody is not what you are trying to say on this table. So we are putting bias in proper context now.
So what I'm saying, in the context of recruitment, that is actually the foundation of recruitment. Because you start your recruitment by conducting needs analysis. What do we need? Gap analysis. Where do we have shortfalls? What do we need? And then job content analysis. What is the job that this role would do? And then the fitness, which is the eligibility criteria. So all of this analysis that you're doing is to define a role. So what you have done is you have conceived in your mind that role, and then you are bringing it to life. And bringing it to life means you need to bring it to life with the elements that you have conceived it with. So you're looking for, let's make an example. You're looking for an accountant in your inventory department. And then you're looking for someone who has worked in manufacturing, who has a minimum of 3-4 years. So you're already defining your affinity. So basically, to summarize and end today's episode, is that there is nothing wrong with having uncommon bias, because it's a cognitive, especially as you define the cognitive part properly and ensure that you steer away from the many other facets of it, such as empathy, or course knowledge, or effort justification, moral credential, the one that is called the IKEA effect or Ben Franklin effect, and all of those things. And you could look those up, and see how they affect the way recruitment is done. But at the end of the day, you just want to hire the person you perceive most suitable and who best fits the role that you have, and that's it.
Well-defined terms, right? Very, very important. Well, thank you so much, our listeners, for listening, and thank you for everyone out there. As always, make sure you subscribe to SOL Nigeria on YouTube, and please use the comment section. Let's know what you think, your questions, and your thoughts. We're here again for you next week on our next episode. My name is Praise Mba.
And I'm Tosin.
All right, nice to meet you all again. Thank you. Yeah.